really I'm taking this as an opportunity to think about some of the gender deficits in representation in local governance and in city governance, and to make an argument about the merits of engendering a debate about a directly elected mayor, and thinking about gender as an important variable and a factor in organising the way we think about new politics and governance, be it on the local or the municipal or the city level. Here we have a number of recently elected female mayors and a candidate for the mayorship in London. Sophie Walker is here asking what her ideas for London are about, and Sophie Walker is the leader of the Women's Equality Party in the UK, a relatively new party, it's established. And it's quite interesting, in the recent London mayoral campaign, we find that Sophie Walker's candidacy had a very interesting effect on the other male candidates, particularly Sadiq Khan, who was of course the winner of that contest, and also Zach Goldsmith, the Conservative candidate, in pushing the candidates towards engendering their campaigns. And we have a very particular set of claims and now actions on behalf of Sadiq Khan in pushing ahead a gender equality platform as part of his mayoral, really his practice essentially, instituting a campaign addressing gender pay gaps for city employees and instituting a commission on the status of women and trying to create a task force particularly dealing with domestic violence and creating a safe city in London for women and girls. Here we also have Virginia Raggi, who is the new Italian, the Rome mayor. So we have certainly lots of controversy and a very different example of how party politics can complicate female mayorship. And she's of course quite embattled currently in the context of certain accusations around her platform for the 5-Star movement, which was an anti-corruption platform, and now some accusations around those officials, particularly female officials that she's appointed, and their past record in terms of corruption. We also have Anne Hidalgo, who is the French, the Parisian mayor. She has adopted a set of very interesting policies and platform positions around what we call women's interests. She has also adopted quite an interesting mechanism where she invited the population of Paris to vote on what they would do with 5% of the investment budget. So they got a choice on how to direct a certain percentage of the funding. And we have also then Sophie Walker, or it's not Sophie Walker, sorry, we have Muriel Bowser here, and she is the only second female mayor elected to Washington DC, and the second female mayor of colour to be elected to that city. And she's also representative of a series of very interesting policies and initiatives supporting a commission on the status of women at the city level and pushing ahead a variety of social welfare, in fact, programmes supporting particularly lone parents and children's interests within the city. Now, there's a lot of text here, so I'm just going to skirt through some of this. Now, there are lots of arguments, some of them intellectual, some of them normative, about why we might engender a debate on urban and local governance. We know in empirical terms that women are better represented at the local level, what is often considered in the literature as the municipal advantage for women. Women like local governance. Why? Because they're involved in the community and voluntary sector more often than men, because these are issues that are related directly to their everyday lives. Some of these debates are quite patronising, they're very essentialist, they're very reductionist around women's role and political agency. But we also know that while women may be better represented at the local level, of course we know they remain a minority at all levels of government. Now, in a fundamental way, of course, we know that men and women participate and experience the city and local government in different ways, particularly in the ways in which we all understand prevailing constructions of gender expectations, gendered institutions themselves, constrain women's access to social, economic, and thus, of course, political resources of the city. Now, there are lots of debates about why, if you increase the representation of women within city governance or at the local level, you get better outcomes in terms of dealing with the challenges more generally of social and economic diversity. You also, of course, allow for a recognition of the diversity of women and their specific gendered interests. And that's a big debate within politics. Do men and women have overlapping interests? Do they have distinctive gender interests? And many people would argue that there are a distinctive set of gender interests that we can associate with women because of their common sets of responsibilities and roles. Women then also have different priorities, and we have some very fine work on women in transport and efforts to do a gender audit of transport services that reveal that women have very different experiences of transport and different needs with regard to transport use. Now, why are we interested in a gendered approach, particularly to the issue perhaps of a directly elected mayor for Dublin? Well, really there are two principal objectives here intellectually. One is to think about women's participation in urban development, and there's a vast literature which looks at the developing world in this context, and also to foster gender awareness and competence among both women and men in the political arena and planning practice. Here really underlining what we already know, and there's a strong evidence base to support, and that is the promotion of gender equality is most impactful when it's built into the budget and pre-planning stages of policy, and these things can be enacted and articulated very coherently and perhaps convincingly within a municipal and a city-based structure. There are also, of course, arguments that I've just alluded to that decision-making improves when gender parity exists, and this is also a contentious debate. Whether you're increasing the descriptive representation of women in these spaces will improve levels of accountability, will push away the impulse towards groupthink, and will create better governance, essentially. Fundamentally here for me in this talk today, this is about trying to make sense of whether if we did elect a female mayor or simply use debates around a new politics for local governance as a way of thinking about improving the representation of women generally at the local and city level, would we then deliver some substantive representation for women? Would we deliver on women's interests in that sense? So what do we know? We know things have changed. Ceilings have broken, but the walls still stand when we think about the descriptive representation of women. And we have the statistics here. I won't rehearse them again. I think everybody has a good sense that women have a very minor role, unfortunately, in most levels of governance, particularly at the local level, even with the increase in the 2014 local elections. We also know there's a gender deficit in local administration. Fiona Tierney, the CEO of the Public Administration Service, she looked at this in quite a lot of detail recently. We know about 60% overall of the staff are female, but they make up about a third of senior management. And here we also have, leaning a little bit on the work of Fiona Buckley and her co-author down in Cork, we know that in many ways, we look at the senior management of local administration, we have a problem, we have a strong gender deficit. And we know the factors, they're well rehearsed in other venues, I won't go through them again. They're often called the 5 C's: childcare, cash, confidence, culture, candidate selection, constituency, workload for elected representatives. And for those in local administration, this is about institutional legacies of the marriage bar, certain forms of constitutional settlement around gender, norms, assumptions, unconscious gender bias, and of course workplace and educational segregation in vertical and horizontal terms, which tend to create these forms of division and segregation according to gender. We also know from work, and I'm going to just give a very brief mention to this, that the Women's Council have done quite a lot of nice work recently talking to women about their interactions in local governance across the country. Lots of focus groups and surveys and interviews. And they also have mapped the gender deficits across the LCDCs and looking at the SPC structures as well. And they have information that corroborates the 2008 survey that, if I have time, I'll talk about, that was done on Dublin City, in Dublin City Council, to mark International Women's Day, called Women Accessing Power in Dublin City, that confirmed a lot of these impressions of women who are trying to, in some sense, increase their leverage or power in their current position or gain access to career opportunities or influence within the elected system, within local governance and within the local administration system. So we also know there have been a variety of different efforts, most of them quite weak, to address gender parity and gender equity within various legislative or proposals, and they've been talked about by Mark and others this morning, even within the SPCs and the LCDC structures. But there are efforts to think about gender parity and improve representation, but we can't necessarily see the effects of those quite clearly when we look numerically, but also in terms of substantively at women's experience of these ways. So what would the merits be of increasing women's presence in local governance and thinking about a female directly elected mayor? Well, we know symbolically there would be some value here. We know the symbolic representation matters for women in politics, the presence of women in local authorities and local councils. This does matter to women. It signals that it's possible to achieve and have access to these forms of power. It also speaks to the importance of establishing a pipeline. If we look particularly at the importance of holding a political office for gaining a seat, we all know what the answer is here, and the data supports it. I referenced Buckley's work here again in 2015. And we know internationally that being a directly elected mayor is considered to be a stepping stone to higher political office in that sense. Looking at the US research here, we know that women who serve as directly elected mayors are more competitive, and particularly if they pursue a gendered policy agenda, they're more likely to run and more likely to win. They also mobilise women. So we've looked at some data here this morning at the very, what you call pivotal, very low turnouts. Earlier you talked about them. One of the most convincing ways we know of mobilising female voters is to have a strong gendered platform and to run a female candidate. And so it could be an exciting way of thinking about engaging voters in these kinds of contests. Now, there is also international evidence that looked at the efforts to use the mayoral office to think about local governance along gender terms. The Spanish cases talked about here, and I'm glad there was some more clarity about this notion of how a mayor is elected in that context. And what we know is that while there have been efforts to use quotas to increase the numbers of women serving in local government and in local administration, there have been very few efforts to use quotas to catapult women into mayoral positions, particularly when those positions have power. And the Spanish case is instructive here, particularly. The odds of having a female mayor decrease as the city size increases. And this is not surprising to those who understand how gender and politics work and how power works in those spaces. Wendy Stokes has done some quite interesting historical and contemporaneous work looking at the use of women's committees in local governance structures in the UK in the 1980s and 1990s, suggesting very interesting ways of really pushing a strong gendered agenda in these particular contexts for improving outcomes for women and children's interests at the local level in particular. Now, using the UK case and particularly referencing Cullen's talk earlier, the Fawcett Society, which is a feminist think tank in the UK, has done quite a nice analysis looking at Osborne's Northern Powerhouse strategy in the Northern context. And again, this really reflects somewhat on, in many ways, the limits of devolution and pushing for a directly elected mayor, for pushing for female leadership. And Colin referenced the 4 female mayors, or 25%. So interesting in the notion that perhaps a directly elected mayoral position open to a female candidate might improve descriptive representation for women. But we have to understand the connection between that and what's happening also in a local administration and with local councillors. Are you finding women simultaneously in great enough numbers in all of these different contexts at the same time? Now, I mention this because when we look at the American literature on this, we find mixed evidence. For some, there is little effect of having a female mayor on substantively advancing women's interests in policy, in public policy. But for others, particularly when they look longitudinally at the largest American cities, we find actually having a woman occupying a directly elected mayoral position, if she has power, and that's an issue that's been raised, isn't it, by everybody this morning, if she's given enough power and resources, in interaction with enough female presence, more than 20% female presence at the local council, we find an effect, a clear statistical effect of having a female mayor on the spending patterns. Now, of course, this is the American system is vastly different than our own, but things do change. We find, particularly for this Richard Smith's research here, when we look at the federal block grant and also for social welfare spending, when women have power in cities across the different venues, the cities become more responsive to women's interests and their needs. This depends on something that Mark raised. It depends on the model. This is more likely to be the case in a mayor-council model. not a mayor-manager model. So the mayor herself has to have that particular agenda, and she also has to have the power to execute that particular agenda in the context of a budget and resources. Here, the findings are interesting. Term length is very important. If she can successfully remain in power for a successive term, she can also shift path dependence in the spending priorities of the city, looking at the American case. Hiring other women into key roles and directing spending, these are the outcomes that have been looked at. Now, I referenced here very briefly earlier the report that was commissioned in 2008, Every Step of the Way, which really showed up, I think, some of the fundamental fault lines in women's efforts to insert themselves in venues for influence within the local administration and as county councillors in Dublin City in that context. And they called for a gender audit. I just did a very brief look at here, and looking at Buckley and Hoffman's work here, you can see that actually Dublin City does pretty well, comparatively speaking, in terms of gender representation. And here we have, in many ways, the critical mass of women in lots of these different arenas. But when we look at the senior management, we find the breakdown slightly different. And again, this is descriptive representations, looking simply at the presence of women, not what they do, not what their agenda is, but their presence in these particular venues. And of course, some of these women do hold senior positions. They are responsible for human resources or for financial resources in the city governance. If we think about what Dublin City Council has done in terms of gendered governance, the only thing I can find from a fairly cursory overview is the UN Safe Cities Global Initiative on Sexual Harassment. And it was the first city in the Northern Hemisphere to sign up to this agenda and to promote the effort of trying to improve safety for women and girls in the city. It commissioned one report that I can't find anywhere, but it was covered in the media at the time, that got a number of women and girls to walk along the North Lewis corridor and do a user survey of how safe they felt in that context. I can't find any visible evidence of any policy or planning that used that report, but that was an indication of an actual specific gendered effort to use the city as a venue to talk about gender equality and to push ahead and think about these issues. Apart from that, of course, what we do find in Dublin City Council is quite a lot of effort to talk about integration and inclusion and interculturalism. And that's where most progress seems to have been made in terms of diversity in that context, rather than gender equality per se. Would a directly elected mayor make a difference for gender equality? We've heard the arguments rehearsed here already: increased accountability, improved coherence, attracting investment, legitimacy, inspiring more civic involvement, empowering individual councillors. Would women in larger numbers in local governance or sitting in that seat make a difference? Well, again, the arguments are there, and there's some evidence. Some of it is incredibly gender essentialist about women having certain core, capacities to be better in governance. But certainly there does seem to be a lot of international evidence support the notion that women do leadership differently. They tend to do what we call distributed forms of leadership. And they do, of course, there's a lot of evidence from the OECD and the European Commission around the business case for gender equality. The notion that economic investment does improve when you have gender parity in your boardrooms. Would that matter if we had more female presence in the mayoral position as well, and that position had power? Now, of course, for feminist organisations and women's groups, they're kind of interested in this proposal. Why? Because they're interested in what an assembly or a cabinet might look like, and how much independent gender expertise could make its way into that forum. And whether, if there was an assembly or a cabinet, would it be possible to have a formal commitment to a commission on the status of women for the city and a rolling budget to address those particular issues. Also, policy coherence and the longer terms of a sitting mayor would also allow a mayor that had a gendered agenda to push that agenda across a period of time if they had the power and the resources. Very quickly, and I'm almost done, there are examples, of course, of lots of mayors, and I know the scales are different, and of course the systems are different. But we know that Sadiq Khan himself has appointed women to head up policing, transport and culture. I mentioned the gender pay audit for local council and city and London employees. And the big American cities have done quite interesting things, all very recently, by the way. 2015, 2016. We have New York, LA, Philadelphia and Boston all coming out with mayor task forces or commissions on the status of women, gender equity plans, pushing as a requirement for all public procurement that there is gender parity on committees, and that anybody that the city contracts with signs up to addressing the gender pay gap with their employees. So very concrete efforts to engender city governance using the mayoral position. There are lots of also recommendations, and I'll finish on these. And these come from the US Mayoral Caucus of female mayors. 18.5% of mayors in the United States are female, and they sit in a caucus, and they have constructed a guide for female mayors in the United States, and these are part of their recommendations. Obviously, one of the central ones is adopting a city ordinance on the UN's Convention to eliminate the discrimination against women, establishing a permanent commission or department on the status of women, and also funding that and using it as a baseline to measure goals and specific actions, supporting a commission, strengthening relationships, obviously, with non-profit organisations that have gender expertise, analysing and gender mainstreaming. This is very important, not the European Union version of gender mainstreaming, which has become a tick box exercise, unfortunately, in a lot of governance structures across Western Europe, but actually gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting used as a specific tool and a requirement of city and local governance. These will be very important mechanisms. And of course, engaging, and this speaks to the new politics, because no one talked about new politics this morning, did they? It got lost in the title, didn't it? Engaging people across political lines. So making this a cross-party commitment. In the same way that we had remarkable success, didn't we, with the gender quota? It's uneven, and it's hard to see what its implications would be. But this notion of ensuring that there was a cross-party commitment to engendering governance through a stronger mayor, and certainly the use of mechanisms, including international mechanisms that have weight and legitimacy in governance structures at the national and local level. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.